Every day, millions of people trust companies to decide what ends up on their table. But that trust goes far beyond the product itself. It touches the supply chains behind it, the way companies source and produce, and the decisions leaders make, often under pressure and often out of sight. In retail, trust is not an abstract idea. It runs through everything, from sustainability and pricing to employees, customers and society at large. And when something goes wrong, the impact is immediate, and trust can disappear just as quickly as it was built. My guest today is Dick Boer. He spent more than 2 decades in leadership roles at Ahold and Albert Heijn, and later led the company as CEO through one of the most significant transformations in global retail, including the merger that created Ahold Delhaize. Today, the company employs almost 400,000 people and serves millions of customers every day. That means questions of leadership, responsibility and trust were never abstract ideas, but part of daily decision-making. Dick, welcome to TrustTalk. Great to have you here. I invited you because you led a company that decides what millions of people eat every day. How did that responsibility shape your understanding of trust?
When you deliver thousands and millions of meals every day via your retail network to the consumer, there's a couple of words of trust that come to my mind. First of all, trust in the food and the quality you deliver. Trust in the supply chain you need to have. So are we buying and sourcing in the right way and have our supply chain developed in a way that we don't abuse trade manners or child labor or whatever. Trust in your store network, which is important. So your consumers need to trust you that you're a great retailer to deliver to them. Trust that your people have, so your own associates, so that you do the right thing. So trust is a big word for a retailer. I can tell you that it comes to almost the whole audience and environment of your business.
Over time, you became more outspoken about sustainability. Did your values shape the company or did the company shape you?
I would say it's more my own values. When you look back, I'm lived in this world of retail my whole life. Even I came originally from where my parents are store. So you live in the values of treating everything well to your consumers. And it came more and more to my mind that if we would be differentiated, but also doing something back for society, sustainability is important as a supplier of millions of products every day. So how do you drive that from your own values into the company, I would say, is more what brings me also to the word purpose. Because I strongly believe in a purpose-led company. And as Bill George once said to me, he wrote his book, True North, on purpose. If you have a purpose, you need to feel yourself. It needs to be intrinsic from yourself, the values. And that's how I run also the company when I was running Albert Heijn or Ahold and Ahold Delhaize at a later stage. How do you deliver from a purpose into the values you have yourself? And then you connect it both sides. It's something you do very personally in a way.
When sustainability or health concerns conflicted with short-term commercial pressure, did business logic ever clash with your personal conviction?
Yeah, that clash certainly when you look at products you can't sell in a store, in the supermarkets, for instance, an example, cigarettes, tobacco, which is of course a product is allowed to use, and there's no ban on cigarettes only for an age perspective, then it's difficult because you're close to health and sustainability, and you still sell these products into your stores. Now, in the Netherlands, has been abandoned by the government, so then all supermarkets are not allowed anymore to sell it. But at that moment in time, when we discussed it internally, and I remember it was in 2006, far ahead of the discussion we have finally that the government decided, I think in 2022, not to sell it anymore via supermarkets. It's still for sale, of course. And so that brings you then to an enormous dilemma, because the numbers clearly showed up that if we would do it, we would lose a lot of our customers. And that brings you then to the moment is to look, The only thing we can do is to be very sure that we bring the product, that we put it in a way that it's difficult to get, but still available for our customers. Similar with health and other things, you have to balance always these things in the right way between a commercial, respectful way and the business.
You've led organizations in the United States, the Netherlands, and the rest of Europe. Did trust mean something different in those cultures?
I think it is because when you come back into, let's say, the more Aryan world like the Netherlands, where you really are, let's say, we all feel the same, whatever level we are, or you have more hierarchical level of decision making, that also influence trust in a way. So there is clearly a difference, to my opinion. And also, when I worked in Central Europe and Czech Republic in the late 90s of the previous century, of course, that society was used to a different way of trust, because they couldn't trust their superiors. They couldn't trust the governments because it was in the communist era. So we, as a modern European company or a worldwide retailer, had to adapt that because we felt there was not a lot of trust between leadership and employees, and the opposite even. Employees sometimes thought, if we paint the shop, we can also bring the paint home and do our home and painting our home. It's also no trust in each other. So you have to build on that.
You just mentioned the Czech Republic. Was there a leadership behavior in other cultures that worked well in one country but not in another?
I mentioned before, I think in my previous answer, also the hierarchical culture of some markets, and they take the US. And the US clearly has a much more hierarchical structure where people are looking up to the boss and what is the decision and then execute it. And that's the same in Central Europe. They're waiting for the boss and then they're going to execute it. So you have to work differently from a leadership perspective. And what I try to do when you work in these markets is to try to bring some of that balance between leadership, decision making, and a process where you engage your leaders and your people in the future of the company, because to my opinion, it always worked better.
When you first became CEO, did you feel fully prepared for the role? And what surprised you most once you were actually in the job?
When you have these discussions, and I had the same, when I was an executive board member, I thought, not a lot different what you do when you're the CEO. Because at the end of the day, you collectively work on the same decisions, etc. But the fact when you become the CEO, you're really the one where the last man in decision making. There's clearly a different role to play. And in the beginning, you don't see that so much. But when you're in that role, you clearly feel, hey, it's clear that here it starts with you and it ends with you. The buck stops here, which is clearly something which is then very visible in the way you run your team. And in good days, there's no problem. But when it's difficult and there are really issues to resolve, then everybody's looking at you.
A large part of the CEO role is working with the board. From your experience, what makes a CEO-board relationship truly strong?
First of all, it's about, to my opinion, sharing information in an honest and truth way. So that's, for me, the start of a relationship with your board. And that transparency of information, the fact that you get them really into your journey, what your strategy is, what you want to engage them in. And of course, it differs a bit which kind of board you are in. If you're a 2-tier board, like in the Netherlands, or a 1-tier board, like I'm in the UK or Switzerland, it is already a different, because then you build together the strategy. The second, for me, is educate your board. So don't forget, board members are more on distance than you yourself. You live the business every day, where a board member is of course, he understands and he reads his information and his files when he comes in and he gets, but educate them also during the tenure of a board membership in what happened in the industry, what happened with competition, what happened with trends, so that a board member can add value in the discussion with maybe a different background, but still bringing enough to the table. And I think the last point for me is use them also and not see them as only my supervisor or my non-execs. How you use the skill set and the capabilities some board members bring to the table and benefit from that. So as a CEO, you can really work together in a way. That is, of course, one difference. They are your boss and they appoint you a quarter in name for the shareholders. But at the end of the day, yeah, if you get a more, let's say, more distant discussion with them, with the board, it doesn't feel good either. And secondly, it will then create less engagement of all together.
In an earlier interview I had with McKinsey partner Sander Smits, he quoted a CEO who asked, "Do you want a team of stars or a star team?" When you became CEO of the combined group, how did you build a star team rather than being the star yourself?
First of all, I think it is your own behavior we start with. So in the combination, when we combined Ahold and Delhaize and became one company worldwide with 80 billion sales today and 6,000 stores, how do you do that when you get two cultures in one house? How do you run it as a CEO? And to my opinion, I've never been a CEO of I. I'm a CEO of we. And we as a team need to settle that. But of course, when you merge two companies, you have to build a new team out of the two companies or with new people coming from the outside. That brings a lot of work in building culture, a common strategy together, and a common execution together where you know what you want to achieve. And clearly with the merger between the two companies, we had a clear ambition of what kind of synergy we want to create, how we want to run the company, and how we want to create a stronger retailer of both sides of the ocean. And that was able only where you were always your team and the executive board and your management teams aligned on the vision and the purpose of the company.
During the accounting scandal at Ahold, you were CEO of Albert Heijn, while the crisis unfolded at the holding company level. When you later became a CEO of the group, that episode still casts a shadow. What does it take to rebuild trust in an organization after a crisis like that?
When you come into a severe crisis, as we had in 2003 within the global company, and I was leading at that moment the CEO for the Netherlands with Albert Heijn and the business there, the whole trust disappeared almost in one day because you lose trust not only from your shareholders, of course, are affected by an accounting scandal, but you lose also trust from your associates because they had trust in their leadership, they had trust in their company and the values they had, and they were sincerely touched by this big problem. And not only because they are associates, but they also have an understanding what the company is doing every day. The customers, not to forget, how you treat your customers and how the trust is impacting the customer trust on your brands. And that takes a long time to repair. And as I said, you have to start from the beginning almost, going back to where your roots are as a company and start repositioning the company back to the consumers. Because at the end of the day, your shareholders will only be happy when you can repair the company into a growth company. And of course, you have to do a lot of other things to overcome all these issues around this accounting scandal. But preparing the growth agenda again, getting your associates again into a positive mode on the company and the trust and the values we had, and then start repairing that. And even when I became CEO in 2010 of the group, you still had that feeling when you talked to stakeholders and shareholders that there was still an overhang on that situation. And we had to continue to work on building, let's say, the trust within all the groups of our stakeholders. And it's an amazing learning process also for humbleness as a leader. You know that when these things happen, you as a leader have to stand in front of the troops and to start getting the company back on track. And it's an important lesson for me that trust really is something you can lose very quickly and you have to rebuild it and it takes long.
After you retired as CEO and now you serve yourself on supervisory boards, has your view changed on what makes a CEO trustworthy? And how do you build trust with management while keeping the right distance?
Yeah, I think it's exactly where one of my previous board members at the time when I was CEO of Ahold said. He said it would be good that you yourself would be a board member. And then you know sometimes what kind of information is lacking when you are in a board. And at the time I was CEO of Ahold, I never had a full board position, but I understand later why he said it. Because it's difficult when you're sitting in a boardroom to oversee all the elements of a company. And some companies you are much more logically engaged as your board member. For me, in retail, consumer, whatever, that's easy. But if you're in companies where you are more distant on the process and the products to sell, you need to be really engage yourself further into what really matters of a successful CEO and a successful company. So that's something where I learned that you have to ask the right questions and you have to sense the right elements of success of a company. And they are not the same for everyone. Of course, great management is important. Great management succession is important, but also the way how you manage your product portfolio and how you grow your company, how you create shareholder value, how do you have a sustainable footprint. So all these elements are coming together. Now, then I come back to the point on the CEO versus the board. Transparency, openness, sharing, information, access to leadership, not only the CEO, are so important for the role in a board.
I wanted to ask you a more personal question. Before others trust you, you have to trust yourself. Did you ever doubt whether you were the right person for the role?
You grow in that, I must say. Your first step as a CEO is maybe the most difficult one. Because, as earlier discussed, you step in a role which you think is more similar to what you did in the other role where you're part of a management team. But suddenly, you're the one who are the decisions coming to the table. And you need to balance the time which you have for all the aspects which you then own as a CEO. Rather, when you go through that process, it becomes even more important. And that gave me, maybe in my history, or at least in my period as a CEO, in one of the jobs I had after my first CEO role in Central Europe, it gave me one other big element where trust came to me as so important. If your own leadership around you is not having the same ideas about where you want to go and how you want to build or rebuild a company or grow a company or the strategic elements, and you don't change that, then you start really questioning yourself. Am I the right leader? But later I understood it was even more important that I had to take earlier decisions on what kind of leadership team I wanted. And then you come to the conclusion that your leadership team might not be, is one of the reasons you start losing your own trust in what you can do. But when you then get, again, a leadership which you select well, which has the right values, which is the right, let's say, quality of leadership you need to have around you with the right values and the right purpose, then you can fly again. So, and of course, yeah, a CEO role is also sometimes luck. It's not all that everything is because you have the right strategy, but it's also sometimes a lucky moment to have that you just at the same time have the opportunity to grow the company faster than your peers are doing, than your competitors are doing. So you need sometimes also a little bit luck in life in these roles.
Following up on what you just said, if you look back, what is one leadership lesson about trust you learned the hard way?
Yeah, maybe it's exactly what I said, the leadership and the team around you. That's the hard way. I have a strong believer in coaching people to the higher levels, bringing them with you. And sometimes it's not possible. And that could be that just the team composition was not the right team composition for someone in the team, or it was the strategic view the person had doesn't fit with the purpose and the view we had. The hard way really is the right people on your team. And I think strategy, you can choose, you can go left, right, you can correct easily when you see it's not working. But the leadership, you quite often takes too late the decision because you, certainly myself, you try to believe the right people and help them to coach them to the right level. But that's the hard way. And then you have to take sometimes decisions which you don't like, but are necessary.
You are now in an advisory role, right? How do leaders build confidence without becoming overconfident?
In a board role, when you were chairman, then you have quite some impact and you can have some influence, but also as a board member. Yeah, keeping people grounded. I think that's what it is. Also, your leaders, keep them grounded and put them sometimes back on the feet and say, look, that's not you. It's the success of you is not only yourself. It's maybe just the momentum. It may be just the luck you had. At a certain moment, you get growth back into a business which was not foreseen and not happened a couple of years before, and you're able to do that. Now, part is your success because you have the right strategy. But at the end of the day, you're not the only one. You're doing that with a team. So ground yourself as a leader and be honest and clear to yourself always. That's how I try to help leaders, and certainly also in my mentoring sessions, how to become also grounded with yourself and with your family. And that's maybe another point. For a leader, I think it is important to have somebody where you have really honest feedback from. And first of all, it's your leadership team, which you have to build in a way that you create a team which is open and honest to each other and able to resolve conflicts when that's necessary. So you can and are able really to talk in an honest way to each other. But secondly, it's sometimes also helpful as a CEO, certainly when you're a CEO, somebody on the outside where you can reflect and who's maybe more open and more direct to you than any one of your executives around you. And that helps you also to be a stronger leader, to my opinion.
What advice would you give a young executive stepping into their first big leadership role?
First of all, I think prepare yourself well. And of course, it's not always possible. Sometimes you're pulled in a role, but prepare yourself. Be sure that you have these elements, which I mentioned earlier also. What do I build the right team? Do I have the right team? Secondly, do I work with my board and supervisors in a way that I can have an open and transparent way of discussing my issues and not trying to hide them or have to hide them because we cannot have that open and transparency. And thirdly, find a buddy. Find somebody where you trust, where you can speak openly about your concerns, sometimes also your fact that you have failures or that you think I'm not doing this well, but that you have an honest reflection of someone who gets you the picture and then also that helps you to improve. And I think what I've seen too often is a leader who at a certain moment comes into a situation where business is not moving well, where the situation is not the way you want, and the market is, there can be stock market, it can be your holding company is getting pressure on you, getting isolated themselves and putting themselves in isolation and start working from themselves only to solve the problem. And then they normally get into a stressed position in a way where they control more than they give the responsibility back to the organization. And if you get a very controlling CEO, you almost know it could end up in a situation that there is not enough empowerment in the organization anymore, and he gets maybe also too much on his own table. So how do you evolve that? And I remember also in my advisory and board roles, you sometimes see that happening and think, hey, this CEO or this leader needs to be open up. And or, if that doesn't work, then you have to take your other decisions. Is it the right leader in place? And these momentums are coming back in your executive life when I was a CEO, and again in your board life, where you see, look, this CEO or this person or this leader of a division is not going to make it.
Dick, thank you very much for these thoughtful reflections on leadership, responsibility and trust. It was a pleasure having you on the TrustTalk podcast.
Thank you very much, Severin. It was a pleasure to have this nice discussion with you.
Thank you for listening to TrustTalk. Trust is easy to praise, much harder to understand. That's what these conversations are for. Hope to see you back for the next conversation.